Emily and I had been together for 4 years. Not married, but living together like we were, with joint accounts, shared routines, and our lives deeply intertwined. It felt solid, comfortable. We had our own way of doing things, a rhythm that only comes from knowing someone for a while and knowing them well. But over the past month or so, that rhythm felt off. Emily had started spending more time out. She'd mentioned drinks with friends, or catching up on work at the office at odd hours. I'm not the suspicious type, never had been, actually. I always felt that trust was foundational. But lately, something was gnawing at me. She seemed different. Little things that most people wouldn't notice, but when you live with someone, you do. She'd get home later, and when her phone buzzed, her thumb would hover just a little too long over the screen before she'd answer. I tried ignoring it at first, pushed away the nagging feeling, but it was like ignoring a slow leak. It doesn't stop, it just gets worse until you're dealing with a flood. So one night, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I looked. She'd left her laptop open on the counter while she was in the shower. I was alone in the kitchen, just me and the open screen. My pulse picked up, and I told myself I wouldn't find anything. Just a harmless peek, right? It only took a few clicks to find it. A thread of emails between her and a guy named Dan. I recognized the name vaguely, a colleague from her office. She'd mentioned him in passing once or twice. But what I saw on the screen wasn't about work. I started scrolling, my stomach dropping with every line. Inside jokes, half-coded messages about meetings that were clearly anything but work-related. The one that really cut was, "I like our games. Ready for the next one." I closed the laptop as I heard the water shut off, feeling like I'd just been hit by a truck. I sat there at the kitchen table, doing my best to look casual as she came out, towel-drying her hair. Confronting her right then crossed my mind, but something in me stopped. This wasn't the time, not when I hadn't even had time to process it myself. If she wanted to play games, well, I could play too. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I was thinking we should take a weekend trip. Just the two of us. It's been a while, don't you think?" She looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. I watched as she tried to keep her face neutral, like she was running through her calendar in her head, figuring out if Herb's schedule would be open. After a beat, she forced a small smile. "Yeah, sure. That sounds nice. We could use some time together." I nodded, keeping my own face blank. It was strange. She had no idea what I'd just seen, or that I'd even be suspicious. But now, I was wide awake, sharper than I'd been in a long time. She wanted a game? Fine. I'd give her a game. I'd make this weekend away one she wouldn't forget. After deciding to wait things out, I couldn't sit still. Each day that passed with her oblivious to what I knew felt like fuel to a fire. But I also knew I had to be smart about this. So, I started preparing. In the evenings, while Emily was out or glued to her phone, I got to work. I went through her emails, her texts, anything I could find. Every time she left the room, I'd snap a photo or take a quick screenshot, collecting each message and little inside joke that hinted at her affair. One line stuck with me. "Can't wait until we don't have to hide this anymore." That one got me. I'd built my life around her, trusted her, and she had the nerve to talk like this was some game. I spent hours gathering evidence, cataloging everything into a neat little folder on a hidden drive. Each day felt like a balancing act, keeping things normal on the surface while my gut burned underneath. And I had to play my part perfectly. Emily was good at this too. She'd talk about her long work hours and meetings with Dan like they were just a routine part of her day. I nodded along, played the part of the trusting boyfriend, letting her believe she'd fooled me completely. The days ticked by. By the time our weekend trip rolled around, I had everything I needed. All the messages, the photos, the receipts, all carefully arranged like pieces in a puzzle. She was about to see the bigger picture, and I could only imagine her face when she did. The weekend came fast. I chose a cabin a few hours out of town, a cozy place surrounded by woods with a fireplace and not much else. A quiet place, perfect for an intimate getaway. We packed up, hit the road, and for the first time in weeks, she seemed relaxed, excited even, as if she thought this weekend might be some kind of reset button for us. But the only reset happening was her realizing I wasn't who she thought I was anymore. We arrived, settled in, and spent the evening like any other couple on a trip. She cooked us dinner, we shared a bottle of wine, and I listened as she rattled on about work and plans for the future. She talked about how we should spend more weekends like this, dropping in lines like she was fully invested in us. I watched her closely, catching every little expression, every smile, every tiny slip. It was incredible to me how easily she played her part. But I played mine just as well, letting her believe I was right there with her. After dinner, I got up, pretending to check my phone. I'd timed it perfectly. Earlier, I'd arranged for a friend to send me a work-related message that sounded urgent. My phone buzzed right on cue, and I gave it a quick glance before sighing heavily, putting on an exasperated face. "What's up?" she asked, looking at me with what I now realized was a shallow sort of concern. "Some urgent work issue," I muttered, frowning at the screen. "I'll have to head back into town. Might take me most of the night to sort it out." "Oh," she said, doing her best to look disappointed, but I could tell from the slight upturn of her mouth that she was already plotting how to use her night alone. "Well, work is work," she said with a shrug, a faint smile crossing her lips. "I'll see you in the morning." I nodded, pulling on my jacket and grabbing my keys. "Yeah, I'll be back early." I turned back to her, managing a smile. "Enjoy yourself." She waved, looking far too content for someone who just had their boyfriend bail on a romantic evening. But I left, closing the door behind me and heading back into town with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks. Back home, I moved quickly. I went straight to our apartment and packed her things, everything that was hers, down to the last makeup bottle and framed photo. I boxed it all up, loaded it into the van, and drove it all to the cabin. The whole thing took just a few hours. Once I was done, I stood outside in the chilly night air, looking at the boxes thrown away by the cabin door, like a silent testament to the end of everything. Inside, I left a simple note on the kitchen counter. It read, "Enjoy your freedom." Then I turned and drove back home, leaving her things behind, ready for her to find when she woke up the next morning. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I sat in my chair, drinking coffee, feeling a calmness I hadn't experienced in weeks. I imagined her waking up stretching, looking around the empty cabin and realizing I wasn't there. I'd left her with everything she needed to figure it out. But of course, she wouldn't get the full picture until she came back to the apartment. I wasn't going to answer her calls or texts. I'd already blocked her on my phone and every other platform. I wanted to keep things clean, no shouting matches, no desperate apologies. She'd have to face what she'd done in silence. And it didn't take long for the messages to start coming through. The first one was predictable. "Hey, where are you? Thought you'd be back by now." I just shook my head, sipping my coffee and scrolling through the news. A few minutes later, "Jake, are you okay? Please call me." I imagined her standing alone in that cabin, confused, probably a little embarrassed that she was the only one without a clue. The frantic texts continued, each one more desperate than the last. I knew she'd have to wait until checkout before she could get back into town and realize just how deep I'd cut her loose. Around noon, I got a notification from the security camera in the apartment hallway. She was back. The video feed showed her standing in front of the door, fumbling with her keys, probably thinking she'd just walk in, laugh it all off, and we'd talk things over. But she quickly realized the lock was different. I'd had it changed the day before. She tried her key once, twice, then pounded on the door, visibly agitated. After a minute of struggling, she finally noticed the eviction notice I'd taped to the door in her name. I'd quietly transferred the lease over to her before our trip, so when I cut her off, she'd legally be responsible for everything, rent, utilities, the whole works. I'd already signed a new place, a clean break for me just a few blocks away. I could only imagine her face as she read that notice. Her calls had stopped hours ago, and I knew she'd started to get the message. This wasn't going to be a clean break on her terms. Then, I put the last part of my plan into motion. I sat down with a folder of screenshots, the evidence I'd compiled over those sleepless nights, and crafted a short email to her boss. I kept it simple. No anger, no accusations, just the facts. I included some of her more incriminating messages, along with a polite note explaining that I thought he'd want to know where all those late work nights were actually happening. And I didn't forget about Dan. His wife's contact information wasn't hard to find, and I sent her the same file. If Emily and Dan thought they'd play me and walk away without consequences, they'd learn soon enough that every choice has a price. After sending the emails, I leaned back in my chair with satisfaction and said, "You wanted a game? You got it. I think you will now remember that there is always someone stronger than you in the game."